Hey guys, welcome to our first roundtable at Shenandoah University. It's a first for the Noetic podcast. And today, who am I joined by? Why don't we go around here and introduce ourselves?
Do I look there or at you?
I don't think it really matters. Go ahead.
I'm really awkward. Sorry, guys. So I am Brianna Gromiko. I am finishing up my undergraduate degree in music education with a performance certificate in, wow, that was hard. Performance certificate in clarinet performance as well. And I teach kids to do music things.
Yay. And she's a really incredible clarinetist.
Fantastic.
And, oh, shucks.
And then there's obviously CJ Eller, who everybody knows from the courses that we've been building on the Noetic App and the conversations about the intersection of music and philosophy. I don't know if you want to say more about yourself.
I don't know. I'm currently a master's student at Shenandoah, and I'm going to go into my doctoral degree very soon. So yeah, so that'd be fun. In classical guitar.
Congratulations!
Guitar with great expressivity
and flexibility. Yes, everything. And who are you?
Yeah.
Who's this guy? I'm like, what is he doing here?
I'm David Chavez. I'm a composer. I'm a church musician. I'm a collaborative pianist, electronic musician. I gig in various places. I also teach music theory courses at a couple universities, including Shenandoah.
Right on.
Yay.
So the thing that we're going to fixate on today, we're going to try to find some sort of intersection between music and philosophy. And I believe sort of off camera, right before we hit play on this, right? We were trying to understand intentional and unintentional appropriation of artistic materials.
Yeah.
And what that means from a moral perspective, what that means from a legal perspective. And maybe, Dave, I'll let you set up the tension of that question a little bit more.
Okay.
And maybe we can sort of explicate that tension with some examples. We were talking about a few examples of this occurring or whatever.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna cede the floor to you.
So the way this discussion started was we were talking about the idea of finishing unfinished works by composers who have passed away, or who have been long dead, some who have just died. I mean, these issues are coming up with Prince's recent death, and should any of his materials be released that he might not want to have been released? What about other people working with them? But this is a question that I like to bring up with my students, particularly in ear training and theory, because I find that this is one of the places where you can apply what you are learning in a very direct way that affects people's lives, and not to be crass, but that affects people's income. I mean, so for example, one of the cases that we were looking at in one of my classes was this case with the estate of Marvin Gaye, and they were awarded a $7.3 million award by an 8-person jury and a judge, and that's not chump change,
No, not at all.
So, and not that, I want to measure artistic value by money. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying with my students, and what I want them to wrestle with, is the whole constellation of questions around the morality, the ethics, and then also the legality, both through legislation and through case law, that we have to wrestle with in that. And I think it's relevant to the question of music theory, and to also just the question of being an educated musician, educated citizen of our culture, because these are exercises in applied ear training in music theory, whether we realize it or not. When you have a jury of your peers, lawyers, a judge, what material do you have to prove or disprove a case with in that situation? You're listening to music, you're analyzing it, whether you have the terminology and the training or not, and you're saying, how is this thing the same as this other thing? How is this thing different than this other thing? Now, where this question gets really thorny for me, but also very important, is when two things. When we're talking about the tension in the development of music between innovation, culture, and communication with itself, and building on the work of others. I think I'm going to mess this up, but there's a famous quote from Stravinsky about, good good composers borrow and great composers steal, or something like that.
Variations.
Yeah.
I think it was like T.S. Eliot was like, good poets.
Yeah, exactly.
Good poets,
and, we laugh at that, but there's a really good point to that. I mean, every artist, every creative person, no matter where in the arts and humanities and sciences they're working, is building on the work of others and should build on the work of others. Yeah. So, I could not put together a 12-bar blues progression and say I now own the copyright to that. I mean, that's a cultural object.
It's like copywriting an idea.
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, our copyright law has the concept of copywriting an idea of intellectual property, And that's a really important concept because it protects content creators. And and we can argue all day about, big corporations and, movie studios, record companies and whatever trying to protect their bottom line. But at the end of the day, I was arguing and getting my students to engage with the question of I believe we have a moral obligation and an ethical obligation as artists to watch out for the disadvantaged in these situations. So what happens all the time, has happened throughout history and still does today, is that people of a disadvantaged class, be it ethnically, racially, socioeconomically, just because of where they grew up, come up with new creative ideas. Those ideas are appropriated by people of a more privileged class and then passed off as their own without perhaps giving due credit. And I was arguing that, we owe it to those whose work we are building on top of to honor them. Sometimes that means through actually paying royalties, through money, but sometimes that just means through telling a story. So, like a famous example would be through, there's an Eminem lyric about how, I don't know the exact words off the top of my head, but, I'm just doing the same thing that Elvis did, using the black man's music to make myself wealthy. And he raises a really good point. I mean, there time and again, there are examples of artists who take music from, in our country and in Great Britain, from the black community, or from people who were former slaves, or from people who grew up in, a poor area of Mississippi playing the blues, who take those ideas and then make millions and millions of dollars, get lots of notoriety for them. And some of those people do an amazing job of acknowledging, where their ideas came from. And then other times they don't. And I think those are really difficult questions that it's incumbent upon us to wrestle with.
All right, so let me try to impose some schematization on this,
Please
right?
do.
So we get a little bit of clarity. I think you've properly illustrated the tension in it and whatnot. And something that Brianna was saying before we got going is that Brianna, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry,
we were just talking about this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I feel like a jerk all the time.
No, it's okay.
Right.
I know Brianna's and Brianna's. I get them conflated sometimes. So the thing that we were talking about earlier was whether or not. So I'm more interested in the ethical dimension of this.
Yeah.
For me, the legality of something proceeds from it being ethical or unethical. So I want to sort of maybe bracket the legal question for a moment here, and then I'm going to bring Brianna in on this question. So off camera, before we started recording, Brianna was talking about whether or not morality or the concepts of morally right, morally wrong apply to this process of appropriation. Now, I can think of some context where appropriation is, in my eyes, would be sort of morally wrong, right? Where someone directly lifts someone else's intellectual material and tries to pass it off on their own. It'd be like me trying to be like, I invented this thing called communism. When really that was Marx's idea, right?
But who did Marx take it? I mean, I think it's like, how far can you go?
Right. So but let's just say that you immediately copy it, or like Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers movies, like goes into the past or the future. I believe the past, and plays the Joan Osborne song. He's like, I wrote that one too.
Oh.
Yeah. Right. So
I've
there's
never
that.
seen Austin Powers.
So there's something. So he time travels and he takes credit for all these songs, right? So that seems to be clearly a case of immorality, right? Now then, there's going to be cases of appropriation that seem to open up new possibilities for artistic disclosure.
That's what I was talking about. Culture and conversation itself.
And I actually think that this. It's not so much the privileged culture taking advantage of the suppressed culture, but oftentimes the suppressed culture reinterpreting the
absolutely.
I'm using air quotes if you can't see this, oppressive culture, right? So especially in the African American community, I mean, hip hop, sampling, things like that, things that were directly lifted from the culture at large, but then put into a new context, reimagined, and have created some of the best works of art that we know about. So we think there are cases where we would see copying as wrong morally, and where we would see other cases of copying as being celebrated. So I think the tension is when does something cross over, right? When does something become, or these distinction, this crossing over, is that an illusion because there is no distinction? All right, I'm going to shut up, and Brianna, I want you to address that question.
I think that's a hard question to answer, though, because
of course it is. Why would I post it?
It's a very situational question too, because as we no, Dave is a composer. So he wrote this really awesome opera, Norton, I think last year, 2 years ago. So I think that if I take one of his melodies from Norton and I take the same melody, but I put it to clarinet, and then I try to pass it off as my own, that's morally wrong.
Yeah.
Because that's not my music. Okay, sure, I put it in the clarinet. I transcribed it. Big deal. It's not my idea. It's not my idea. That's morally wrong. But then when you're talking about copyright and stuff, what about the things that are already public domain? Mozart is public domain. So anybody can go and download his music. Anybody can play it. You don't have to pay for it because it's public domain. So if I write a piece and I use an idea, say, from the Mozart clarinet concerto while writing a trombone piece of music, is that stealing? Is that morally wrong? Or is that me taking this idea and expanding on it? Or I was listening to this podcast the other day and they were talking about sharing ideas and how that would affect our society. So if you apply that to music, and if I come up with this idea, okay, well, am I going to share it? Or do I want to keep this idea all for me? Does that make me selfish then? If I don't want to share that knowledge that I've acquired.
Yeah.
You know? So it's a difficult topic.
There are other moral issues going on there.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to say the degree of imitation would determine regardless of the public domain nature. Sure, you can copy that Mozart stuff, but if it is a perfect sort of imitation of it and you don't give credit to it, then that seems like you're doing something morally wrong. But if you use it as a departure point and then expand upon it, I don't know, and get away from it, or maybe revisit it in some way, it seems less morally wrong in some way to me.
Yeah,
let's CJ.
No. I said let's go on with expansion, because I think that's maybe where we're finding this quote unquote good stealing is expanding on an idea rather than just sticking to it. So I don't know.
I was going to use an example of what you're talking about, and that's most of the music of Charles Ives. So I took a class with Dr. Tom Owens at George Mason as part of my doctorate on the music of Charles Ives. He also taught another class that I didn't get to take, but around the same time the whole class was on musical borrowing. And I like that term rather than stealing, because I think that's borrowing and quotation are terms that come up in musicology, music theory a lot for what we're talking about. And there are scholars, and I think one of the main ones, his name is escaping me right now, who have done extensive work on cataloging and analyzing the musical borrowing in the music of Charles Ives, a very important American composer. And it is so rich and varied, but I think nobody would argue that his music is unoriginal. His music is blindingly original for its time, and many people would make the assertion that it's well ahead of its time, like he was doing. There are scholars who go back and forth on this, but there are a lot of people that argue that he was doing in the first decade of the 20th century what a number of other composers weren't trying until the 30s or the 40s.
Do you think maybe that originality has to do with the amount of things that he's borrowing? Because a lot of his, I mean, even within one piece, there may be like 7, 8, 9, 10, songs that he uses, or hymns,
sometimes 20 or 30 if it's a longer piece. Yeah. What I started realizing taking this class is, because I'm not in the milieu of like late 19th, early 20th century New England. Yeah. Going to that church, listening to those, bands in the band shell, going to these parades, I was only picking up 3 or 4 things. I know that tune as Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, or I know that patriotic song. When in reality, inside, say, one piece of music, one symphony, one movement of a piano sonata, there could be borrowings from 30 different things. But the way that he takes them and melds them together becomes a new, exciting, creative object. And his intention also was very, and maybe this affects the morality of it too, was very uncommercial. He gave up the idea of being a professional composer very early.
Yeah,
made
his
real
living, insurance.
Made his fortune actually as in the insurance business, and ended up supporting the work of a lot of other creative people. So his intention was never really to profit off of other people's stuff and not credit them. Mm-hmm. He was more following his own creative muse.
So it seems like to me, given the Charles Ives example and given the example that I sort of use with like hip hop using sampling and stuff like that, there seem to be at least 2 ways that one can avoid the charge of immoral appropriation. There's the first is sort of like you take something as a departure point, you expand upon it, and maybe it's a motif that you come back to or something to that effect. And we'll have to ask if that's really a solid way of evading the charge of imitation. Sure. And then the second way would be if you reconfigure a bunch of things. Like I would say, like this is something you would see, say, in like heavily sampled work that's like there's nothing but samples in it. Sure. Like DJ Shadow or the Avalanches or something like that. If you take this cacophony of sounds and put them into something really, really super beautiful, then you've created something new. So what do you guys think about that as being two ways to evade the charge of being an unethical way of imitating or appropriating?
I like the second one because there's a lot of examples even not in music. I remember there's this essay I read by this Italian writer named Umberto Eco, and he talked about Casablanca. And he's like, well, you see all these different references, not even from movies, but from literature. Like, oh, you got a Commedia dell'arte character there. You have, this lone noir guy here. And you got all these different things going on. He's just like, in that cacophony of ideas and borrowings, like, that's what makes it great. That if it was just like one thing, it'd be like, meh. But it's just like this cascade of just like, oh my God, it's all this stuff that just kind of blows your mind. It's not, and it also reminds me of, I can't remember who said it, but the guy said if you steal from one author, it's steal, or if you take from one author, it's stealing, and if you take from 30 or more, it's research.
Well, yeah,
like, where it's like, well, yeah. So but then the question too, I guess, from that is like, how many samples or borrowings do you need to do for it to be okay? Like, what's the limit? I think maybe that's we can expand upon. It's like, what are the limits of expansion? What are the limits of volume of borrowings?
How about I'll go for an extreme example. Art is something that is in the eye of the beholder, that is experienced by the beholder. Like, look at the Fluxus movement, Dadaism. So Marcel Duchamp takes a urinal, calls it art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking,
is that that's obviously cultural borrowing in a way.
Well, I'm sure he paid for the urinals. So I think it's okay.
But he didn't design it. But he calling it art, is a creative act that challenged a lot of other people's expectation of what art is.
Well, I guess what I want to kind of, and maybe we can, after we sort of cordon off some areas and try to understand, we've gotten our minds around this a little bit. We can talk about how this plays out in other art forms. But so when we talk about like Duchamp or whatever, we're talking about we're under this presupposition that the rules that apply for music automatically apply in gallery installations and paintings and things like that. Yeah. And it may be the case that they're disanalogous. It may be the case that what counts as imitation and what's ethical and unethical in music may not be the same. Those same rules may not apply in, say, photography. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so I want to keep our mind on music a little bit more. So I don't know. Like, I remember like when I was a young kid, like growing up, there were two big issues that everybody lost their minds about this particular issue on. And I do like CJ's point about the number of borrowed elements. It seems like the more borrowed elements that are in it, the more original the piece becomes. But like there were two massive hit songs when I was like 10, 11, 12 years old that like borrowed heavily from other songs. And this Vanilla Ice's Ice Ice Baby borrowed heavily from Bohemian Rhapsody.
Under Pressure.
Under Pressure. I'm sorry.
Queen and David Bowie.
David Bowie. I'm sorry. So and I think there was I think Queen mounted a lawsuit against Vanilla Ice. I'm not sure. And then there was MC Hammer's Can't Touch This, which borrowed heavily from Rick James's Super Freak.
Right.
So and both those songs, the bass part is so pronounced and so essential to both songs. When they lifted that, did they? Now, I had never heard, Under Pressure or Super Freak before. So like that made me get back in touch with Rick James and Queen. And now I'm not an MC Hammer fan and Vanilla Ice fan, but I'm definitely a Rick James and a Queen fan. Largely in part as a result of this sampling. So some good came out of it. I
totally agree. But I was actually going to use the same example. I heard that sample first through Vanilla Ice. And this is where the legal and the moral run into each other, because now there's a much better legal framework that the art was ahead of the law. In terms of there's a better legal framework for properly compensating people when you've sampled things. For paying royalties, there's a set way of doing it now that works. And I think that's a way of avoiding the moral ill if you're properly compensating somebody. But there's also a great moral good, even when the art, like what you're talking about, was maybe ahead of the legal framework, in that I had the same experience. I went back to hearing the Queen and David Bowie song, appreciated it, and I too now appreciate that music much more. But I was introduced to it through this one, through this sampling.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we got two music people here. I mean, talking even about like a bass line. I know I'm music. We got four. I'm sorry. No, but just talking about bass line and how, I mean, that's pretty much the frame. Or at least like the bass is like almost like the harmonic framework of a piece, and whether like taking that whole harmonic framework, is that bad necessarily? Because I mean, that happens in jazz with contrafacts where they take the same chord. You can't. I think like we were saying earlier, you can't copyright a chord progression. You can't copyright 12-bar blues.
And contrafacts are as old as the medieval and Renaissance too. I mean, that happened all the time.
Oh, motets, taking one song.
Cantus firmus from a chant or something. I mean, that's how so much music developed.
Yeah. And then kind of bouncing off of that, then I guess the next question is, how much sampling is too much?
Right.
Because, and that's, again, a really hard question to answer. But, I mean, like you said, you can't copyright that. And then when do you make the distinction between this is in the style of the classical period that everything ends with a half cadence and then a one.
Yeah.
And then, okay, that's just characteristic of the music versus, look, it's the same chord progression across all of this stuff.
So you're almost going into like stylistic.
Yeah, so is that a characteristic of the style? Or, and that's, again, how much is too much? I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's this really good one on NPR, and they were talking about what is original, and kind of about the same thing about in music.
Do you remember what podcast it was?
It was
curious.
Not Hidden Brain. I'll look it up for you.
Okay.
Hidden Brain's really good, too.
Hidden Brain's
great. They were talking about what is original. And they used the example of this one song, Lottie Dottie. I don't remember who did it. It was before my time. I'm the youngin' here. But it was before my time. But then it was just a mind-blowing podcast because they showed how all of these people after that group used different things from that song, and then that was the kickoff for rap. And they used this one excerpt, and they played this excerpt from Lottie Dottie, and then they played a Miley Cyrus excerpt, and it was the same tune, the same words put into a pop style. Yeah. So how much is too much? And then the song starts with them yelling, "Hit it!" And then they found out that is used in 40 other songs since that one. So
it becomes a motif.
So is the song Lottie Dottie, is that just a really good idea-filled song that people just took snippets from and went? Is that okay?
Or is it a stylistic thing,
or is it
like
a
you're saying, where it's
stylistic
just
thing
where it's
that
just
he
like
just kicked off the style?
We're using
kind of like how Beethoven bridged a gap between that classical and Romanticism era. So did this guy just bridge the gap and start the new style like Beethoven?
Because it almost sounds like using it from a stylistic perspective. It almost sounds like giving an homage, or kind of like
and people
bowing of
the
bowing of the hat to another to the tradition of
in
rap.
Jazz. Rhythm changes, like the chord changes from "I Got Rhythm," the Gershwin tune, like that's just that even outside of that song or people playing that song as a standard now, just that one set of chord changes is a motif, like the 12-bar blues, or like the other various pop progressions. That, I mean, I would argue all those things are a moral good, because they've built culture in some kind of a productive way.
So what I'm discerning from this conversation so far is that it becomes we think we might be able to determine what falls into these particular zones of morality or immorality, but it seems like it's pretty. We can't, because we can't talk about how long that we like.
And there are some copyright laws on how long too. I think there's something that says if you use more than 8 to 10 consecutive measures, it's copyright.
Well, it shows
copyright law is really complicated with music.
But it shows that's completely arbitrary, right? Like the fact that
and separate from morality and ethics.
Right. Yeah. So 15 seconds of sampling something versus 14 seconds of sampling something.
Yeah, that 1 second of immorality.
So it becomes so we, just as we think like we have some way to sort of schematize this, it becomes really like nailing like Jello to the wall. So it seems like it has to come down to discerning intentionality of the person that is doing the appropriating.
But do you think that's Emma's nailing Jello down to a wall as well?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about it too much.
So what comes down to it? The question of whether something's moral or immoral?
Yeah.
That's the central question.
Because there's like if you want to take Mozart and compose something on the trombone or whatever, right? Like in a way you've introduced novelty or whatever, but like if you're trying to be like, oh yeah, like this entire thing came from me, and we can call you on it. Like, isn't that just enough to say that this is wrong, right? If we can catch you, like, trying to pass off something that's not yours.
But when are you catching me? And when are you saying, oh, that was a cool idea, how she brought that little motif that we knew from this piece back in?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question. Like, length is not enough. And I think, I like how you're focusing on the moral question as separate from the legal question. Like, if I take one sample from one source and do something super creative with it, which happened. I mean, like, let's take Steve Reich using a recording of One Young Man for the Come Out. I don't know if you're familiar with this piece, Luke, but it's an amazing I love
Steve Reich, but yeah.
So it's one of his earliest tape loop pieces, and his kind of what became his style of pulse phase minimalism. And it uses a recording of a young man who was, and I'm not going to get the whole set of stories right. One of the Harlem Six, I want to say they were called. It was kids who were subjected to police brutality.
Yeah,
and,
I remember this story.
In the '60s, and were wrongly accused of some things. And this kid says in this recorded interview, I had to like open the bruise up and let a little bit of the bruised blood come out to show them. Come out to show them, and then come out to show them becomes this repeated motif. And that's really, like, that recording of this person speaking is the only source material, and Reich builds this much, much, much longer piece out of it.
Yeah.
But I think that he is doing, and people have debated this too, I think he's doing a net moral good because he's giving a voiceless person a voice again.
So I think we can just, I think what becomes interesting, right? It's very hard to discern people's intentions, right?
Yes.
Because I was using some examples earlier about some artists where it seems like there's some synchronicity. Example I was using was Katie Lang's Constant Craving and the Rolling Stones' Where's My Baby, are very similar. And they just were like, oh, we had no idea. And it may have been unintentional. Maybe they just heard it on the tour bus once, or Keith Richards heard it on the tour bus once, and he forgot about it, and then it came back in subliminally, and he never meant to borrow or anything like that. The
same thing with the Sam Smith Tom Petty thing that happened recently was he said almost the same thing.
He's like it just kind of unconsciously gets. So let's say we take people at their word, right, and we're not we're not surprising them, and we can say if they don't intentionally do it for the purposes of trying to steal other people's intellectual content and pass it off as their own, I think another interesting moral question becomes if one has very good intentions, like with this, come out, is that, or I can think of who did the Transmigration of Souls? Was that
John Adams?
John Adams, where there's the reading of the everyone who died in September 11th, right?
Yeah, so that was the piece that the New York Philharmonic commissioned to honor the victims of September 11th.
All right, so
and he does it he described it as a memory cathedral, I think. He creates this memory space, kind of a memorial space in music, but uses a lot of recordings of the readings of people's names and recordings of actual, I think, phone conversations or things that happened on that day.
So then the question becomes, what if someone with the best intentions, wants, hey man, I want to expose your music to a new audience, or I want to take this moment in time that's been recorded on newsreel or audio, and I want to turn it into a song to make people understand the political or historical significance or something like that. And then what if CJ and I have been dealing with this a lot in the course that we've been making on Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida, how much do those individuals have possession of the otherizing of their voice, of their content, right? Are we, if that person objects, let's say one of the families from the Transmigration of Souls piece, one of the families that died on September 11th, didn't think that it was tasteful for John Cage to do that.
John Adams,
John Adams to do that. What do you do when someone objects? it was like, no, I'm not cool with that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not cool. So which morality do you honor there? Do you know your aim is true,
right.
but if it's perceived as exploitive to someone who is part of that situation, which wins out?
Yeah, do you respect the person? That almost seems really question. Yeah, it's a tough question, but it seems fascinating because it almost sounds like we're saying that there's not really a overarching good that, okay, if somebody thinks it's not good, then I shouldn't do it. Or it almost sounds kind of pragmatic in a sense, where it's like we're not really sure, like, and we're talking about intentions, and like we can't really know what the other person I don't even think the composer or the person that made it would know fully, like, yeah, I did this little riff and like I can't really remember, like, you know, or it'd be like, oh, it's mine. They could have heard it. They could have heard something and took that riff from somebody else. Like, I am talking about blues and, you know, black man's music. Like, where did they hear that from? Oh, they heard it from, you know, slave songs. But where did they hear it from? Like, if you just keep going back, like, how far do we have to go back? You know, is there even like a first mover in regards to sampling or anything, or is it just like something where it's just like it just keeps going and going and going? I think it's almost like torrenting in a way, because I think, I can't remember, I don't know, somebody was telling me about how when you torrent something like a movie, like you're actually taking little bits from the people that already torrented
Good analogy.
it.
Yeah,
the people that already torrented it.
Right.
And it just keeps going and going and going and going. So like, when, like in regards to like legal trouble, people are like, yeah, we can't really find the person that uploaded it first. Yeah. Because there's so many people that they're taking from. Yeah. So it's just kind of like, where do we stop? Like, then they're just like, we just won't bother because it's impossible. I'm just wondering maybe if it's like impossible for us to even, or anybody to even, because I mean, I feel like we're all kind of quote unquote borrowing, you know.
Well, there's a difference between things that are broader cultural objects and things that are more specific personal objects, and one can cross into the other domain.
Yeah, totally.
But so I'll go back to the transmigration of souls example. I would say that if I'm writing a piece of music and I want to use the words of a single individual who went through an experience that is unique to that person, and maybe it was a traumatic experience, and they say, I would prefer that you did not use my words that I spoke to you or that I wrote down or whatever, then it would be immoral of me to just take their words and use them, in most cases. But in the case of the September 11th example, and you see this even in legal language with lots of things that kind of become, public property isn't the right word, but that become, that's a communal event in the worst way. So if one person objects to me using the words of their family member or something, I think you have to balance that against the needs of the whole community. Like if I'm creating some kind of, like, I'm going to make a visual art analogy here. If I'm creating a stone memorial to the whole community and one person who was involved in the event doesn't think that memorial should happen, and I'm dishonoring their family member, should I not create that stone memorial? I think it's this. I think it's a similar question. So, and this gets to some of the. So, Luke, I think your question gets to some of the heart of, like, in the West, since I guess the Enlightenment, we have a really strong idea of individuality, particularly in America. There are lots of other cultures where, you know, when it comes to music and a lot of other things, we have a much less strong idea of individual ownership. So there is the idea in some cultures that when you create music, and even in some Western traditions, like it becomes a community object. It becomes a communal piece of property. I don't think we could ever completely shift our society to that, but I think it's possible that morally sometimes we can go too far the other way, saying like, no, this is mine, that's yours, that's yours, that's yours, when we can do a greater moral good by being a little bit more willing to share some of those things. And September 11th is a perfect example. Like, if I want to create a memorial to that, I think that I'm doing a moral good if I do it well, and if I do it in a way that honors people. If say I as a family member allow that to be a community shared piece of culture.
Yeah, I mean, and there's lots of things about how the individual get integrated into that memorial or that tribute, right? Like, do you have? I mean, can you control your name, right? Obviously, like people can write about my name in the press or anybody else's or something like that. But then, like your likeness,
yes,
right? It's a totally different issue. It'd be the nature of the tribute, and I think I guess the thing is, I'm a little bit hesitant about the sort of being completely communitarian about the nature of sampling and things like that. Cause
I don't want to be.
Yeah.
But I think we can go too far the other way.
Right. Yeah. I think there's concerns like there's a lot of real private moments that we wouldn't necessarily want to like sort of get out there, right? Yeah. Like things that we may find that we're like excessively vulnerable and we want to put a stop to. I think maybe as far as artists go, I mean, I think it's always best to ask. That's
Absolutely.
always best to ask in advance, right? So, like, if you want to use this particular thing for your composition, I think it's best to ask in advance. But, I don't know if it makes a moral difference if you go and use it and you make it and you spend all this time on it, right? And then you've got this artifact that you've made.
Yeah.
Like, and it's incredibly hard to make music, right? Especially electronic music with all the different tracks and everything like that. So if you go and you excessively sample and then like you go and put a record out and everybody's enjoying it, and then like 6 months later, the person who's the subject to the sample is like, I wasn't asked to be on this record. Like, at that point, what ought one to do? I mean, I think it's always best to cover your bases in advance so that it doesn't get litigated. But I'm still trying to figure out whether or not you see to that person's concern if you've already put something out there in the world.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
is it my turn?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's sort of something that you guys both touched on that I was going to bring up, that in the politically correctness society that we live in, the politically correct thing to do would be to ask everybody before you even get started, right?
Yeah.
Because why are you going to waste all this time, put your time, your energy, your money into something if there's even the possibility that somebody might not approve of it? Mm-hmm. But then you have to say too, but then are you blocking your own creativity by doing that then? Now, I would say, as I don't remember who brought it up, but as somebody said, if you're using, as far as this example goes, a long chunk of somebody's words, yes, definitely ask first. That's not yours. And as you're saying with the vulnerability thing, that might not be something that I would want out there. So if I had said something to you in private, and then you, being the composer that you are, said, okay, this would be cool in a piece, put it into a piece, played it, I'd say, hey, Dave, what's up with that, bro?
Oh, yeah, I would always ask you.
So I think that something like that, yes, definitely ask. But then if you're talking about reading of the names or just a long list of something, back to you said, is it for the greater good of the community then that we can build this morally right thing? So yeah, it's a difficult thing. Like, do you want to stifle your creativity just because somebody might not agree with you?
I'm curious, what you think of that, because I mean, I can almost think of like hip hop, like we were talking about before, where sampling and these copyright and getting the permission costs so much money. And you're talking about oppressed culture, or like oppressed people, whatever. You're talking about people that may be making music and don't make that much money or whatever. And that maybe taking these samples and not really worrying about copyright, is that okay to be pragmatic in that case? And then also too, when does a thing become not yours? Or like when you put it out in the world, is it yours really? Like at that point?
And was it really the person's before yours?
Well, yes, exactly.
That's the individuality question.
Yeah.
Because there's a separation even from you and the thing that you put out in the world. I mean, like, I don't know, like, think of it as like, I don't know, Dave's our perception of Dave or of Luke or of you. It's just like once you are like, okay, this is me, I'm CJ, I'm really happy, and I'm like, yay! Like, is that can I really control that? Like when I push it out into the world? Because maybe some people are like, I don't really like CJ, he's kind of too happy, or maybe like, he's kind of cool, he's all right. I mean, when does that?
I'm going to create some art where I parody his happiness.
And I'm going to be like, fuck you, Dave, I don't want you to do that. But seriously, how much, I don't know, I'm interested in that question. I don't know if we can go down that way, but like, how much is something yours when you put it out?
I think the ethical question, the moral question of whether, when a person is obligated, So, Luke, the question that you were asking about how responsible are you when creating, a big work of art, and so let's say after the fact, to ask everybody's permission. Yeah. And I'm talking morally now, not legally. And then the same thing that you were saying with the the time consuming and the
or the
money
creative stifling
to
that
get.
Bree was talking about. Yeah.
So I was talking to a guy yesterday who does a lot of hip hop beat making. And he mostly uses, pre-existing recorded material and then modifies it and does creative things with it. And he knows that, there's limits to what he can sell and how he can sell it. Mm-hmm. But he puts a lot of it out there on SoundCloud. People rap over it. Other people remix it. There's a real fertile community happening online in SoundCloud of this kind of thing now. Mm-hmm. I would argue that he, as somebody who right now is in college, amateur musician, not making a lot of money, and, music isn't even his full-time gig, has a much different set of moral obligations than somebody who is a Pharrell or who is a, Beyonce's latest album is a perfect example of exhaustive covering of all of the bases and crediting everybody that could even possibly be infringed upon. But that's just, in my opinion. She has the resources. The people working with her have the resources to pay everybody to cover all their bases, to look after all, to look after all the legal and ethical questions there. And I would argue have more of an obligation because of the amount of money that they're undoubtedly going to make, because of the public platform that they have. They have a different set of moral obligations than somebody who's a kid in his dorm room just working with material to learn how to do his craft, to get better at it.
So this is like a moral double standard you're kind of
absolutely. I'm absolutely suggesting a double standard, and not even a double standard, but kind of a sliding a continuum, if you will.
So I think what you're trying to say is that the urgency, the moral urgency of the issue comes in gradients depending on how successful you are, right?
And the resources that you have,
right?
Yeah.
But we're defining success, I think, on a monetary value, it seems like. Because, it sounds like what we're saying, okay, if you can pay off the samples and you still have a little bit to make it, or you still have a little bit left over for rent and a hot dog,
and also the burden
okay.
of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And this gets right back to back to the biblical Adam and Eve questions, the knowledge of good and evil, and when you know something's wrong, and how wrong does it know? There are a lot of people who have ignorantly borrowed, stolen, copied, whatever you want to call it, other people's stuff without knowing any better because they were young or because they hadn't learned about, what the expectations in their culture were for what's community property and what's personal property, did something awesome with it, and helped advance culture in some way, I would say.
Yeah.
And they didn't know any better.
Yeah. I guess the only problem is we don't have the omniscience of God to be like, you ate from that apple, didn't you?
No, we don't. We don't.
So it's we're all just in the garden and we have no idea Did he take from the tree of knowledge? I don't know. He seems pretty okay.
But I think we can all agree that that young kid, unknowingly maybe stealing more than he should have at some point, it has a different moral culpability than somebody who's a record producer making 7 figures who should know better.
I tend to think that there's a moral baseline that it's pretty. It should be. I don't really think it requires too much elevated intellect to understand that if you are sort of taking from things that aren't yours, right? That you need to get some sort of permission in advance. The question is how.
But how are you benefiting from them?
Whether you are or not, you're still kind of taking someone else's sort of private moments or creativity or something like that. Whether you are successful or not, I don't think really matters. I think the interesting question becomes, to what extent do you pursue getting that permission? Because it's not going to be super easy to get that permission all the time. You may be appropriating something from someone who has died, right? And there's an estate that you have to consult, or a TV show from 1954 or something like that that's really obscure. Now, if you're the kid in the dorm room, do you need to go all the way? Do you need to follow that trail of breadcrumbs back to that?
I think then that comes down to a question of, are you trying to sell this for a profit? And what is your intention for doing this? And I don't know if you can even label that, because if that kid in the dorm room is trying to sell those tracks for profit, then you have a moral obligation to give credit where credit is due, because that's not your idea.
Well, credit is one thing. Permission.
Okay.
Is
well,
permission.
even permission, because that's not yours. that is not yours. So if you're trying to sell it, or if you're just giving it away and saying that it's yours and trying to tell everybody, yes, this is mine, is it really yours?
So then
or is it theirs in the first place?
Or was it even the other person's? I don't know. Like, where does this all come from?
Well, it depends on the thing that we're talking about. But I think what we'd have to do is you'd have to rein it in. I think what you'd have to say is, I have this amount of resources to get that sample cleared, and like Beyonce has like a legal team that can go much further than me.
Absolutely,
I will make my best effort with what I have. If I get it, I get it. If I don't get it, then it doesn't go on the record.
Yeah,
I think that's probably what you might have to do, because if it may just be like one phone call to a studio like in LA or something like that, or to a person living in Minnesota or something like that. But if you expend all these resources in order to get it, you just might just be like, screw it. Like, if I'm really that creative, then I can find something else to supplant it, right? I mean, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think that
your moral persistence goes as far as your resources allow.
Yeah, and I agree, because I agree. I do agree, because then you can say, well, a lot of marching band shows, to bring it back to a different type of music. For example, Disney has a very tight rein on their stuff.
Oh, yeah.
They just do. They're Disney. They can't. So if I am a band director and I want to do a Disney show, but I have an arranger, my arranger, I want him to get permission from Disney. But if I don't have the resources to get permission from Disney, then my arranger can't arrange what he was going to do. So then, it does go, do you have the funds to pursue this permission? Or would I just be better buying a can chart from J.W. Pepper that's already legal?
But does that sound like creative? Does that sound like the creative stifling that you're talking about before, though?
Oh, Disney is one of the. I mean, people who get into the ethical questions of this hate Disney so many times, because I've heard a lot of people argue that Disney is a great killer of creativity in the amount of control and the amount that they try to hang on to things, squeeze as much money out of them as possible, and sometimes aggressively prosecute anybody who.
So then, what is the extent
might be trying
of
to build on their?
Yeah. So what is the extent of protecting one's information, then also creative monopolization of certain ideas? Like, what is the extent to that? We're talking about limits and like how far? Like, how far is it being okay? I made something and this is mine, or just being an asshole and just trying to get money from people? Like, what is that?
Viehard on YouTube would argue that Disney is going well in the asshole direction by having expensive lawyers and expensive lobbyists who can manipulate the law into what is advantageous to them, which is then very different from what is maybe morally right or morally good for the development of culture.
So does this conversation on that become all just about like if we push back the veil, is it all just about money? Like, I don't.
Well,
but seriously.
As someone who's trying to create a small business that's very much like predicated on intellectual property, I mean, I understand Disney's point of view, and I'm not trying to make a sympathetic case for Disney or something like that, but like if they didn't sort of corral their intellectual content, then they couldn't take care of the creatives within house and continue to make the great things that we like about Disney.
But though everybody says too, I mean that or at least
if someone was hijacking all the Noetic stuff, it would mean I wouldn't be able to make any more Noetic stuff.
I don't want all my music to be communal as a composer. I want to have, as a composer, I want my rights to be protected, and I'm thankful for. I mean, even unfortunately, sometimes for other entities that, without pure motives, may have done the moral good of helping to get a legal framework around the things that protect me.
Yeah, but even Disney borrowed things. Even like Steamboat Willie was apparently some kind of Buster Keaton, like they took from this Buster Keaton Steamboat whatever, I can't remember, but so it's like maybe the crux of people calling them assholes is like that they're hypocrites.
And there's also a theme in the really cheesy but one of my favorite movies, August Rush, from the August Symphony. There's a guitar theme in there that I want to say it's a John Williams piece, but John Williams did not write the music for that movie.
It's just very much in the vein.
Oh, it's not even in the vein. It's the same thing note for note in a different key.
A modern example,
So is that okay? And then, like, going back to the Disney thing, I have a really, really great friend who's an awesome musician and an awesome composer and arranger, and he actually just finished this brass ensemble arrangement from the final song in Star Wars: The Force Awakens, and he transcribed it by ear for brass ensemble. So, and he played it for me yesterday, and it was just beautiful. And he did that from ear, so he didn't physically take a copy of music, but can he ever perform that then? Is he morally allowed to perform that? Because it's not his work.
But that's such a big thing in classical music, right? Theme and variation on a theme by
this was like note for note transcription, except he took it from full orchestra score and then condensed it into brass ensemble with percussion. So then is that something that, can he ever perform that? And then obviously he can't sell it if he doesn't have the funds to get the permission from Disney to use the transcription. Well, it's not his work.
So is it okay then? Like the kid in the sampling and stuff, is that fine then?
Yeah, is that okay?
I'd be okay with that morally, because it seems like it required a tremendous amount of creativity and effort
and work
for him to reconfigure that into that way.
I'm definitely okay with it.
Yeah, I'm very okay.
And it's also, he's somebody who's learning. This is part of how he learns.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any danger of, John Williams and Lucasfilms and Disney's profits being impacted by him doing this. Like, he's not going to do damage to their business.
Dave, you brought up a great point, that this idea of like borrowing is how we learn.
I think that's the point Stravinsky was making.
Think of little Bach, as a kid, he would take scores and write them down. I think there's a great story where his brother was just like, you can't transcribe these, and he just put them in a little closet. And little brother Bach went into them late at night and found a way to take them out, and he was just transcribing by night. He stole them and then he's just writing them out at night. But this idea that we need I'll even say stealing is a part of learning, or borrowing. Well, I like saying stealing because I'm not original.
You're not going to give it back.
No, yeah, and that's another thing too. When you say borrowing, it's it requires us
But maybe you can give it back. Yeah, maybe you can give it back. Yeah. Maybe you can pay it forward to the next generation.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe you can give it back by like I was talking about earlier, by telling the story, by honoring those from whose work you were building upon.
But it almost sounds like borrowing, or at least doing that, is essential to how we learn, and that to try to stifle it in some way with legal parameters would seem kind of But maybe that goes back. In tension.
Yeah, but
maybe that goes
in
back
balance
to,
with each other. I don't want to stifle people's creativity by saying you may never use any of my music in any way.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to completely open all the floodgates and say you never have to compensate me in any way. There needs to be some kind of balance between those things.
Well, that's... Oh, sorry.
No. Well, I think what I was going to say... Well, Brianna, you go first, and then I'll chime in.
See if it...
Are you sure?
Yeah, sure.
Are you lying?
No, not
okay.
please.
Okay. I don't remember. What was I going to say? Oh, you don't know what I was going to say.
You're going to have to tell us.
I don't remember.
Well,
see, you cut me off. I interrupted, and now I don't remember.
It's
Go
fine.
ahead.
All right. Well, I'll say my thing, and then maybe it'll jog your memory. So, what's interesting to me is, so I've kind of been I've been sort of the one here that keeps going back to sort of the pure ethical questions here, and I wonder if that's problematic because. At some level, the legal considerations and the profit considerations feed into a more robust moral understanding of the situation. Like I haven't talked about profit at all. I haven't talked about what case precedent or something like that. But there does seem to be something immoral if certain individuals are entitled to a certain share of money, right? And that this thing cuts into it. The profit factor enters into it, and then also case precedent, right? So if it was decided one way in one particular scenario, but then we totally ignore that for a pure conception of morality, it seems like we're neglecting basic judicial fairness on some level. So at some point, the pure ethical bleeds into the capitalism and the judicial system.
It does.
But do you think that the ethical, or at least the legal, is not based on some kind of ethical standing, or at least that profit is not that money is not based on some kind of ethical standing?
No. I definitely think it is. What I'm just trying to say is I've been looking at just how the ethical determines the business and the judicial side of it, but also I think you have to kind of work in reverse and look at the judicial and business side of it and see if
see
that affects the ethical.
And it might go to
they
what
kind of
Dave
go back.
said. Yeah, it might go to what Dave says about the Enlightenment, or like in this kind of individualism. That
it'll depend a lot on the context and the cultural context, the time period, the location. So like I would have a different set of legal obligations depending on what country I'm in. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that ethics are completely different depending on where I live, but I think that if I have different legal obligations because of a different culture, a different system of living, a different economy, that does affect my ethical obligations.
Yeah,
it doesn't define them, but you're right, it does bleed into them.
Yeah, I guess the point I was trying to point out was that I've been making this case that they're easily divorceable, but they're not, and that's sort of what I'm running up against.
The real world is so messy.
Yeah. When Brianna's talking about her friend that had done this brass recontextualization of Williams or Star Wars or something to that effect, I'm like, oh yeah, I start those concerns start to come back into it. So maybe it just seems like anytime I think I've got this thing kind of corraled, it gets a little blurrier.
Point. Yeah,
oh, sorry.
Did you remember?
No. Well, I did, but then it wasn't relevant anymore. So no. Okay. So different. Well, related. But so if we take money out of the equation, then something that we had talked about on the discussion was CJ brought up the idea of Mahler 10 and how he never finished it, but somebody else did.
Derek Cook.
So then I argued CJ, and I said, okay, but then can you consider that all Mahler?
Well,
it might be,
I'm not sure.
Or would you consider it based on Mahler or in the style of Mahler for that last movement or so?
I'm not sure the extent of.
So how is that? Wow. Is that morally okay?
It might be a bad example just because he did. I mean, Mahler did leave a lot of sketches and.
Same thing with the
scores.
Mozart Requiem.
Yeah, and that Derek Cook. The guy
for those listening at home, Mahler's 10th Symphony was unfinished at the time of his death.
Only the Adagio was finished.
Well, so we're coming up on an hour here.
Yeah.
I have to go for a 7 o'clock rehearsal.
And so I think time has really flown, but I think it's a separate issue talking about the incompleteness of certain works and other individuals finishing. I think it dovetails nicely into this conversation.
Well, I guess podcast number 2 then.
Yeah, I think.
Here we go.
But I think having the conversation, and I think maybe what you're talking about, like you can't corral it. I think just recognizing that all of this is just very ambiguous, and we can't really put a finger on it, or we can't really nail the J-Lo to the wall. But I think just talking about it, I think is as fruitful, if not more so, than trying to corral it.
That's what I was. I mean, to try to bring this full circle in some way, that's basically what I was trying to get my students to do this week, as a way of applying your training skills. And one of them got a little frustrated in one of my classes. Said, like, I don't understand what we're supposed to be learning here. And I said, like, this is not your SOLs in high school. This is not standardized testing. There's not a right answer. I'm sorry. Like, the reason I want you to do this is not to find an answer, but to wrestle with it.
Yeah, to find
and
questions
to understand that
answers,
in your life, if you ever go to grad school, in whatever your career takes you. And one of the other students said that, like, yeah, you're teaching us life lessons. It's like, yeah, there's not going to be simple answers. It's going to be hard to find absolute that this is always right or this is always wrong or whatever. Like, but part of your obligation as an educated musician and citizen of the culture is not to make easy flip decisions on these things, but to wrestle with the difficulty. And then I think, hopefully, and I didn't use these terms, but you will aspire to a higher moral good in the way you conduct yourself as a musician, as an educator, as a composer, etc.
All right. Well, that was a pretty good inaugural roundtable.
We did it.
Yay. All right. We'll do it again soon. All right.
Yes.
See you guys.
Brianna will remember her thing, and then we'll start with that.